Hello.
Hey, Terry. I'll go on mute, Terry. Handling some firefighting in the background, right? So let's see if somebody joins. Then is that fine?
Yeah, no problem.
Hey, Andrea. Hey, Jeremy.
Hi, Nimesh.
Hey.
How are you? How's it
Good. How are you doing? So I will just go very quickly with the status, Andrea, and I probably want to also see from your side, right, where we are. So one of the things is let me find out if we have it running here. So right now, we are at a point where, and if you look at this, the Qflow pipeline, let me see if I have so this is our, just the starter, Watson pipeline, which we test, right, if we can run end to end, or at least, subset of the end to end just to, train and store a model and then deploy using Watson machine learning. And this one right now, we are, let me try to see if, okay, so that is getting initialized, right? But so there is one which we have run before. And by the way, this is, Qflow pipelines running on top of Tecton, right? So the goal is, exactly to get the same behavior, right, which we would want. So this is the one, right, which we ran before, while the current one is getting initialized. So if you see, look at the config and the run output and the graph, there is no difference, which, somebody will see from the perspective of, whether it's Argo behind the scenes or Tecton behind the scenes, right? The fact that, we are getting the logs as is, as things function. The next of the things which we are working on is, integrating the ML metadata and the artifact. Artifact is almost getting very close. ML metadata is what we are integrating, right? So I think so far so good, right? And behind the scenes, if you bypass this, right, yes, there is the Tecton UI as well, right? So if you see, it's triggering on Tecton right now behind the scenes, the current pipeline which I launched, but you can actually, enter through this world, right? Which is essentially the Qflow pipeline world, or if someone wants to jump directly to the Tecton experience, right, they can get it from that side because that's essentially what's happening there. So far so good. I think this is, now showing us that, this is working to the extent we wanted as part of the MVP, and we exactly should be able to give the same experience, right, to the Qflow pipeline backend with Tecton, right, which the folks with, the Argo backend are used to, right? So the couple of things which Andrea, like, so the two things which remain a blocker on the Tecton side are essentially the conditions and the second part, which is, the looping functionality, right? These are the two big blockers. Obviously, I saw both of them were in some sort of proposal stage, right? So I wanted to get a sense from you, like, what is the typical Tecton community timeline where, proposal comes in and at least there is a version of the implementation, right? Even if in a branch in a PR, right, which can be a candidate. Or have you seen any of these two actually moving further from the design proposal phase?
Well, the conditionals, I wanted to ask about it because, I mean, getting it to beta has just started. It's in design phase, but we do support conditionals. So it's an alpha version API, but we have some form of conditionals. I don't know if that's enough for, I mean, it should be enough for getting basic conditional functionality. But yeah, so we may need to clarify that offline. In terms of designing the beta version of conditionals, that's really just started. So just the proposal was made. Unfortunately, I missed the last meeting because it was a bank holiday for me. But so I don't have the latest status on that, but I've not seen any update really on that yet. So usually, I mean, if there is an agreement, it really depends on how fast the PRs are contributed and maybe review bandwidth. So it's important to have people available for reviewing the changes and having quick feedback loops. So if the change is not a major one, it can happen relatively quickly. One release, two releases. If it's a major change, it may take a bit more time. So depending also on the experience of the contributor. And so loops, I feel it's not a small change. There are a lot of consequences to implementing that feature, and I think it's very much going to be implemented. I've not seen any pushback on that, so I think we have enough use cases, and it's clear that it's a good feature to have. There are several alternatives, I think, for its implementation. But yeah, it's moving forward.
Okay. So I think on the condition side, right, I mean, yes, the functionality exists in alpha, right? But from the perspective, right, so when we are taking, for example, the output of the Qflow pipeline compiler, right, we are producing a pipeline run spec, right? And so that's when once you take it to the backend, if something is in alpha versus something is in beta, then, how do you leverage, the CLIs, and then you need to take multiple of these specs. Those are the challenges, right? So the ideal condition for us is that, this is in beta. So you're saying that, the key thing is, like, have you seen this moving now into beyond the planning into some sort of code, or it's still in planning or discussion phases?
It's still on discussion phase right now. But yeah, so in terms of tooling and so forth, I mean, the CLI, for instance, for Tecton works currently with a beta version of the API for pipelines and everything else, and the alpha version of pipeline resources and conditionals. So you don't have to change tools to use different version of API. So it's a combination that is supported right now by Tecton. I mean, the main disadvantage of the alpha version is that, of course, changes may happen. So you have to follow those changes. Even in alpha, what we do, before we make changes, we usually deprecate them in one release. So we always deprecate them in one release and remove them in the next one. So you have this 2 release time to adapt to breaking changes. While in beta, it's quite different. It's several months that we ensure. I think it's 9 months before we can, when we start deprecating a feature, before we can actually change it in the API. So that's the main disadvantage. Of course, one thing is getting conditions to beta. The other thing is also extending the functionality of conditions and improving it. There are some drawbacks in how conditions are implemented today, or some limitations, and this is also something that this proposal that you have open here is addressing.
Okay, so when we produce the pipeline run spec, does it include the condition spec correctly? Because my understanding is that since that functionality is in alpha, the pipeline, you have to bring the condition spec separately.
You can include conditions in, the beta pipeline run spec, in the pipeline spec.
Leverage that. Okay, let me check back on that side then. So the loops part you said, right, which Greg was handling, right? So that's also, you were saying right now is, at this point, in the reason I'm getting, that's probably, if you see the point of, it was in discussion phases and some GitHub issues, and yeah, then it moved to that design doc. And even there, I see people sort of, going and posting multiple opinions, where do you need the loops, whether it's a pipeline level, whether it's a task level, right? So my concern is, it's like, is there like a time limit that, hey, I mean, you cannot have something in discussion for more than 2 months, right? Thou shall move, have a bias for action, right? So what triggers that, right? And I'm hoping, something triggers that for the looping part, right? I mean, the general understanding, almost everyone in the community, yes, you're right, has understood that it's needed. The point where it is not reaching is, people are sort of agreeing on one and saying, okay, let's move it forward now. Enough of discussions, right?
Well, the thing is, as I was saying, it's rather a major change compared to what we do today. So we just want to ponder carefully, especially because we are now in beta. And if we introduce a new API or a new capability, we want to make sure we're going to live with that for the next 9 months. So that's the reason for the discussion. I don't think there's going to be much more discussion on that. I think it's getting to a point where we're probably ready to move ahead, but I probably need to circle back with Greg and see what he thinks on that. It's also a matter of how many people is available to contribute the code and redo the reviews. So there is a limited bandwidth in reviews and in contributions. So of course, the more engineer we can get there and knowing Tecton and doing reviews and helping with that, the better speed we can gain.
So how do you notice so like, I mean, obviously I see, with IBM, Red Hat, Google, right, I'm aware of. What's your general sense of the commitment from these teams, right? Is it increasing, decreasing, at a steady level? How is the
Right.
typical size of the Tecton community at this point?
In terms of contributors, it's evolving. So maybe slightly, I think it's slightly slowly increasing now. It's getting a bit of momentum in terms of people that is actually focusing on contributing. So there are a few, couple of new folks that are definitely spending a lot of time to quality reviews, so which is great to see. And that usually you can see it because there are new features coming out and other features that are moving faster forward. We have a lot of things in scope. One of the things that is a high point of focus and importance for Tecton community now is the catalog and the hub, which is a way for people to discover tasks and to have a good, something like the Docker hub, or if you want the Helm repos, where we'll have different tasks that people can pick with versions. So you can rely on a certain version of a task not changing for you, and different level of support. So we're considering having tasks that we test automatically, where we do like CVE scanning automatically. And so this kind of functionality, and that's taking some time from some of the contributors. But yeah, there are some new contributors as well in the community, which is good. But it's not like a huge number or huge growth. There is a definitely growth in terms of people interested in using Tecton, that's for sure.
Yeah, no, there's always, the open source trajectory, the users multiply much faster than the contributors, right? I mean, you always want that healthy balance of more and more users converting back to contributors, right? And helping out. So on the catalog, and when you say the hub, right? So typically, I mean, my understanding was, and there were a couple of issues where we went back and forth, that Tecton is going to provide the framework, right? Which is, this is the YAML for defining a catalog task, etc., right? But not necessarily stand behind any tasks, right? So for example, in the Qflow pipeline, there are certain components where vendors stand behind those components, right? So Google has its own components. We have our own components. And if there are issues, right, which come up around those components, right? AWS has their components. Is that the notion which you are going to move forward in Tecton, like as a community to begin with, you will stand behind certain core tasks, or no? The philosophy is that, we have the framework and we are not going to stand behind any implementation of the tasks that's, more user responsibility.
So the current proposal is that we're going to have three levels of support, so to say. So we're going to have like official tasks that are maintained by Tecton owners and that are regularly tested, scanned for CV, and yeah, so they're maintained by the Tecton community. Then we're going to have verified type of tasks that are not maintained by Tecton, but they are also tested in the same way. So they're contributed by other third parties, yeah, so they're tested. And then we were going to have like community tasks that are best effort, if you will. So they're contributed by external parties. They can be discoverable through the hub, but there is no guarantee about testing or anything for them. So this is kind of the framework that we are considering.
No, I'm sorry, I missed the last part, right? So you're saying that there will be certain tasks behind which you will stand behind, or no? It's mostly going to be the framework.
Yeah, no, there's going to be tasks that they're going to be maintained. So as I was saying, we're considering three levels of support for tasks. So tasks that are maintained, with what we call official tasks that are maintained by Tecton, by the Tecton community. Those are tested, verified, and maintained by us. Then we have intermediate level, which are tasks that are also tested automatically, but not maintained by the Tecton community. And then there is going to be community tasks that are contributed by third parties and not tested by us in any way. So yeah, so
Great. So that's a step forward. And do you see putting up some sort of API around this, or it's mostly like GitHub, these other implementation of the tasks?
So there's going to be two components. So the catalog itself is Git based, so the tasks are stored in Git. But there is also going to be a hub, which is a web UI and that allows you to discover this task. And I've not seen advanced hub design yet, but there may be an API as well to discover them. So there's going to be.
Okay, and which team is behind the hub? Who is driving it?
It's Reddit mostly, but
Sorry?
it's Reddit.
Oh, Reddit is driving it.
But it's also high importance for Google. And yeah, coming from
Yeah, no, I would like to understand more. So I'll sync you offline on this. So I think we are probably reaching towards the end. Cherry or Jeremy, do you have any questions? Robert, you want to bring up or anything?
Nothing on my end, thanks.
Cherry, anything from your side?
Yeah, making steady progress on the MLOps roadmap. But, nothing special that we need to discuss today.
Okay, cool. Thanks. Robert?
Yeah, I'm just kind of lurking here. So I'm trying to come up to speed on what the group is doing and just understand.
So I think, yeah, high level is, again, as you said, right, technically there is one project, right, which is active, right, where we're bringing Tekton and Kubeflow pipelines together in a more seamless fashion, right? And that's where, also my question was around the hub perspective, right? Because we are planning and we have implemented a version of the components hub or Kubeflow pipeline components hub, right, which we are planning to figure out, moving it in the open source, right? Once we sort of, rebase it also to include Tekton tasks, right? So I mean, Kubeflow pipeline components have their own YAML syntax, how they are defined, right? Which is obviously a bit different from Tekton, right? And what we want to provide is a more seamless single entry point where whether it's a component or a Kubeflow pipeline component or a Tekton task, end user experience should remain the same in terms of using it within their pipelines, right? Or within the Kubeflow pipelines, right? So we had a version of the UI which was very Kubeflow pipeline centric, right, for the hub and the APIs. Right now, the next set is, so that's why I want to understand the components part of it. But yeah, the main technical project is this, and then Terry drives, a much larger, MLOps roadmap where as he working with, users and consumers and customers on his side, what he is seeing as surfacing as the requirements, right, where this field is going, right? So he has done very extensive and good job of listing, and defining that roadmap. So that's how we are sort of balanced at this point, Robert.
Well, so I have, fairly deep interest in MLOps at this point. So I'm involved in a couple of communities for that. So that would be an area I'm interested in. I don't really know very much about Tekton. And I don't really have a good feel for the time horizon on the roadmap for that as far as the integration with Kubeflow.
So we have, the integration with Kubeflow, right? It's two levels. One is, do we have the code running, right? So as I was just showing, the code is running now, right? So you can essentially, and you can, use our compiler, right? Which is in this repo.
Mm-hmm.
Here, you can use the compiler, right? So this part, which is essentially, compile and run, right? So fairly well tested, being documented, right? So like we are hitting 80% of the Kubeflow pipelines, which can be compiled. Things, as I mentioned, right? Not every feature is going to be 1:1 mapping between what Argo provides versus what Tekton provides. So those are the areas, right, where we continue working with the Tekton committee community, right? So Andrea is our IBM committer and, part of the governing board on Tecton side, right? So he's our eyes into that community from an IBM perspective, right? Who looks and prioritizes the requirements we have, right? And there are, quite a bit of requirements, right? So as I mentioned, I was going through this. So the loops and the conditions are the big ones, right? But for the most part, you should be able to now run using this, compiler, and then, compiler compiles. And then, if you want to take the code to the backend, right? Once you have done the compilation, there is, the corresponding repository, which has the backend code, right? Which allows you to upload the pipeline, run it as if it is running on Tecton, and behind the scenes, you see that, it's essentially triggered on the Tecton side, the same pipeline which you are running on Kubeflow pipeline, and you get the same experience. So yeah, I mean, if you are interested in using it, by all means, it's in the first stage where you can actually, get started and start running it.
Yeah, so I need to carve out some time to try to work with it and get more familiar with it.
Okay, sure, thanks. Yeah, and in general, if you're interested in the larger roadmap, then Terry is your go-to person. Jeremy is here, who is here is, he's the overall Kubeflow technical lead. Andrea, as I mentioned, is the Tecton committer. And myself, I'm heavily involved in a lot of the Kubeflow projects, right? So I come more from that perspective and more from Kubeflow perspective, less of a Tecton perspective, but now it's sort of, intermingling where we are now becoming users of Tecton, and a lot of the Kubeflow behind the scenes CI/CD pipelines, right? Jeremy has been, getting them converted to Tecton as well, right? So the community on the Kubeflow side is leaning more and more towards Tecton. Great, thanks, guys. So talk to you then in the next sync up. Thanks again.
Cheers.
Bye. Thanks.
Thanks.